Cassidy Mitchell, 34, stared at the Christmas table in disbelief. 12 plates were meticulously arranged, but her 7-year-old daughter Emma's place was conspicuously absent. When confronted her mother, Barbara casually replied, "There weren't enough plates for non-family members." Those words shattered everything Cassidy thought she knew about her family, setting off a chain reaction that would expose decades of secrets and ultimately lead to the most satisfying revenge she never planned. Before I get into how my entire family imploded over a missing dinner plate, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop your location in the comments and hit that subscribe button if you enjoy family revenge drama. Trust me, you'll want to stick around to see how karma comes full circle in this holiday nightmare. The Mitchell family had always been the epitome of the American dream in their small Connecticut town. Barbara and Richard Mitchell, now in their 60s, had built a respected construction business from scratch, raising 3 children in a sprawling colonial home with a perfectly manicured lawn. Cassidy, the middle child, had followed the expected path: college marriage to David, a successful architect, and eventually giving birth to Emma, who was supposed to be the cherished first grandchild. Family gatherings were always elaborate affairs at the Mitchell estate, with Barbara orchestrating every detail to maintain their image of perfection. Thanksgiving featured hand-calligraphed place cards, Christmas had color-coordinated gift wrapping, and Easter showcased personalized baskets. Barbara's attention to detail was legendary, which is why the missing plate for Emma felt so deliberate. Growing up, Cassidy had always sensed a subtle difference in how she was treated compared to her siblings. Her older brother Michael received the newest clothes and the largest bedroom, while her younger sister Jennifer got the most attention at recitals and games. Cassidy existed in the middle, often feeling like an afterthought. She'd convinced herself it was middle child syndrome, nothing more. Her parents had paid for Michael's entire college education at Yale, while Cassidy had to take out loans for her state university degree. When Jennifer needed a down payment for her first house, Barbara and Richard provided it without hesitation. But when Cassidy and David asked for help with their mortgage during a difficult period, they were lectured about financial responsibility. Still, Cassidy maintained the peace, always making excuses for the disparity. Mom and Dad had more money when Jennifer was in college, or Michael needed more support because his major was more demanding. She'd spent years rationalizing away the inequality, desperate to believe she belonged in this perfect family. When Emma was born 7 years ago, Cassidy hoped things would change. Initially, Barbara seemed thrilled about her granddaughter buying expensive baby clothes and showing off photos to her friends. But as Emma grew, Barbara's interest waned mysteriously. She'd forget to call on Emma's birthday or cancel plans to babysit at the last minute. Richard followed Barbara's lead, becoming increasingly distant from his granddaughter. The contrast became impossible to ignore when Michael's son was born 3 years after Emma. Suddenly, Barbara was an enthusiastic grandmother, attending every soccer practice and piano lesson. She created a dedicated playroom in their house for Michael's son, but claimed there wasn't space when Emma came to visit. David had noticed the treatment first, pointing out the discrepancies that Cassidy subconsciously buried. "Have you noticed your mom never posts pictures with Emma on social media?" he asked one day. But her profile is filled with photos of Michael's kid. Cassidy had dismissed his concerns, accusing him of creating problems where none existed. "She's just been busy," Cassidy insisted, though the knot in her stomach tightened. As Christmas approached this year, Barbara had made a big announcement about hosting the entire extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, and all 3 of her children's families. "It'll be just like the old days," she declared excitedly during their weekly family call. "I want everyone under one roof for the perfect Mitchell family Christmas." Cassidy had been genuinely excited. Perhaps this would be the opportunity to strengthen family bonds and create the warm memories she wanted for Emma. She'd spent weeks selecting the perfect gifts, helping Emma craft handmade ornaments for her grandparents, and even baking Barbara's favorite cookies as a peace offering of sorts. When they arrived at the Mitchell estate on Christmas Eve, the house was stunning. Twinkling lights adorned every eave. A 12-foot tree dominated the living room, and the scent of Barbara's famous roast filled the air. Everything seemed perfect until that fateful Christmas dinner, when the carefully constructed facade of family unity finally shattered over a missing dinner plate. The Mitchell family Christmas had begun like a scene from a holiday movie. Fresh snow blanketed the ground outside the large bay windows, a fire crackled in the ornate fireplace, and carefully wrapped presents spilled out from beneath the towering tree. Emma had been vibrating with excitement all morning, wearing the red velvet dress Cassidy had bought specially for the occasion. "Do you think Grandma will like the ornament I made her?" Emma had asked repeatedly, clutching the glitter-covered star she'd spent hours perfecting. "She'll love it, sweetie," Cassidy had assured her, ignoring the voice in her head that whispered otherwise. When they'd arrived, Michael's son Tyler had been greeted with enthusiastic hugs and exclamations about how much he'd grown. Emma had stood awkwardly to the side, waiting for her turn that never really came. Barbara had merely patted her head briefly before turning back to Tyler. Throughout the day, Cassidy had noticed other small slights. Barbara asking Tyler what he wanted to drink while ignoring Emma standing right beside him. Richard showing off his train collection to Tyler while telling Emma not to touch anything. Still, Cassidy had swallowed her discomfort, determined to maintain the peace during the holidays. Then came dinner. Barbara had spent the entire morning preparing, refusing any help in the kitchen. Everything has to be just right, she'd insisted, arranging her special holiday china and crystal glasses that only emerged for important occasions. When Barbara finally called everyone to the dining room, the table looked magnificent. The antique mahogany gleamed under the chandelier light, fine china plates were positioned at every seat, and name cards were placed with precision, except there wasn't one for Emma. At first, Cassidy thought it was a simple oversight. "Mom, there's no place for Emma," she'd said quietly, trying to keep her daughter from noticing. Barbara had glanced at the table with an expression that Cassidy would later recognize as not surprise, but annoyance at being called out. "Oh, well, she can sit at the kids' table in the kitchen." "The kids' table, Tyler, is sitting here at the main table," Cassidy had pointed out, noticing her nephew's place, setting between Michael and his wife. "Tyler is family," Barbara had replied without hesitation. "He's the Mitchell heir." The room had gone silent. Cassidy could feel her husband David tensing beside her. "What are you talking about? Emma is your granddaughter," Cassidy had said, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay calm. That's when Barbara had uttered those unforgivable words. There weren't enough plates for non-family members. Emma had looked up at her grandmother, her small face crumpling in confusion. "But I am family, Grandma. I'm your granddaughter." Instead of backtracking or apologizing, Barbara had looked directly at Emma and said, "No, dear, not really." The silence that followed was deafening. Cassidy felt as though she'd been plunged into ice water, her body simultaneously numb and burning with rage. David had immediately taken Emma's hand and led her away from the table, murmuring something about going to get their coats. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Cassidy had demanded once Emma was out of earshot. Richard had tried to intervene, placing a hand on Barbara's shoulder. "Barb, that's enough." But Barbara, perhaps tired of maintaining whatever secret she'd been keeping, had simply shaken her head. She was going to find out eventually. Might as well be now. Michael and Jennifer had exchanged glances that made Cassidy's stomach drop. They knew. Whatever this was, her siblings were already aware. Find out what Cassidy had asked, though some part of her already understood that whatever came next would irreversibly change her life. Barbara had straightened in her chair, smoothing her linen napkin, as if they were discussing nothing more significant than the weather. Richard isn't your biological father, which means Emma isn't really a Mitchell. I thought you knew. Everyone else does. The room had started spinning. Cassidy had gripped the back of a dining chair to steady herself. Everyone knew. Everyone except me. Michael had at least had the decency to look ashamed. Mom told us years ago. We thought you knew too. Jennifer had nodded. It's why they couldn't help with your mortgage. Dad's will only provides for biological children and grandchildren. In that moment, the disparities of her childhood, the subtle rejection, the unequal treatment, it all crystallized with horrific clarity. Her entire identity had been built on a lie, and worse, she'd been the only one kept in the dark. Who, Cassidy had managed to ask. Who is my father? Barbara had waved dismissively. It doesn't matter. It was a mistake, a fling before Richard and I were married. He agreed to raise you as his own, but legally you're not entitled to the Mitchell name or inheritance. Cassidy had looked at Richard, the man she'd called Dad her entire life. Is this true? Richard had refused to meet her eyes, staring instead at his perfectly arranged dinner plate. His silence was answer enough. Without another word, Cassidy had turned and walked away from the table, away from the people who had systematically excluded her while pretending to love her. In the foyer, David stood holding Emma, who had tears streaming down her face. I want to go home, Emma had whispered. Me too, baby, Cassidy had replied, taking her daughter into her arms. We're going home right now. As they'd driven away from the Mitchell estate, snow beginning to fall more heavily, Cassidy had made a silent promise to herself and to Emma. This wouldn't be the end of their story. It would be the beginning of something entirely new. The 3-hour drive home from the Mitchell estate passed in near silence. David occasionally glanced at Cassidy, clearly worried but unsure what to say. In the back seat, Emma had fallen asleep, tear tracks still visible on her cheeks. Cassidy stared out the window at the passing landscape, her mind racing through memories, recontextualizing her entire childhood through this new, painful lens. By the time they pulled into their driveway, the digital clock on the dashboard read 1:37 p.m., Christmas effectively ruined. David carried Emma to her bedroom, while Cassidy moved through the house, mechanically turning on lights and adjusting the thermostat. Their own Christmas tree, modest compared to the Mitchell extravaganza, stood in the corner with presents still waiting to be opened. Do you want to talk about it? David asked, tentatively after tucking Emma in. Cassidy shook her head. Not tonight. She couldn't process it yet, couldn't put into words the profound sense of betrayal that was consuming her. Sleep didn't come. Cassidy lay awake until dawn, scrolling through old family photos on her phone, studying Richard's features and comparing them to her own. How had she never noticed the lack of resemblance? The brown eyes that didn't match his blue ones, the curly hair when everyone else in the family had straight. These differences had always been explained away. You look like your maternal grandmother, Barbara would say dismissively whenever Cassidy questioned why she didn't resemble her siblings. The next morning, Cassidy went through the motions of Christmas Day for Emma's sake. They opened presents, made pancakes shaped like snowmen, and watched holiday movies. But Cassidy felt disconnected, as if she were watching her life through a pane of glass. By evening, when Emma was playing with her new toys, Cassidy finally broke down in the kitchen, sobbing silently into a dish towel so her daughter wouldn't hear. David found her there and simply held her until the tears subsided. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I need to know the truth," Cassidy replied. "All of it." The days between Christmas and New Year's became a blur of investigation. Cassidy ignored the cascade of texts and calls from her siblings, who suddenly wanted to explain after years of silent complicity. Instead, she focused on uncovering the secret that had shaped her life without her knowledge. First, she pulled out her birth certificate from their safe. Father Richard Mitchell, a legal document but apparently a lie. She then dug through boxes of childhood memorabilia that Barbara had given her years ago. to make more room in our attic, she'd claimed at the time. Now, Cassidy wondered if it had been to remove evidence from the Mitchell home. In a faded photo album, she found pictures of her pregnant mother, with Richard standing awkwardly beside her, his expression more resigned than excited. In contrast, photos of Barbara pregnant with Michael and Jennifer showed Richard beaming proudly, his hand placed lovingly on her belly. The visual evidence of the difference in his attachment was striking. Cassidy also discovered an old journal of her mother's forgotten at the bottom of a box of high school mementos. Barbara had apparently given it to her by mistake. The entries stopped abruptly around the time Barbara would have become pregnant with Cassidy, but the final entries mentioned frequent arguments with Richard and referenced someone named Jay repeatedly. "I saw Jay again today. R suspects something but doesn't have the courage to confront me. This can't continue, but I can't seem to stop myself." The mysterious Jay must be her biological father, Cassidy realized. But who was he? A breakthrough came when Cassidy remembered her maternal aunt Susan, who had had a falling out with Barbara decades ago. They hadn't spoken in years, but if anyone would be willing to tell the unvarnished truth, it would be Susan. It took some digging to find her contact information, but eventually, Cassidy located her aunt living in Arizona. The phone call was awkward at first, with Susan clearly surprised to hear from her after so long. "I'm calling because I need to know who my real father is," Cassidy said bluntly after brief pleasantries. There was a long pause before Susan sighed heavily. "So, Barbara finally told you about James?" James. The name sent a jolt through Cassidy. Finally, a real person, not just an initial in a journal. James Kavanaugh, Susan confirmed. "He worked with your mother at the bank before she married Richard. They had an affair that continued even after the wedding. When Barbara got pregnant, Richard knew it might not be his, but they agreed to raise the child as his own to avoid scandal. James was transferred to another branch in Boston and eventually lost touch." "Did he know about me?" Cassidy asked, her throat tight. He suspected, but Barbara refused to confirm it. "The last I heard, he tried to make contact when you were about 5, but Barbara threatened to file harassment charges if he came near you." Richard supported her decision. He was always desperate to maintain appearances. The revelation hit Cassidy like a physical blow. Not only had her mother lied about her paternity, but she had actively prevented her biological father from knowing her. "Is he still alive?" Cassidy managed to ask. "As far as I know, yes," Susan replied. "Last I heard, he was still in Massachusetts. He never married or had other children. I think losing you affected him deeply, even though he never really had you to begin with." Before ending the call, Susan promised to email any information she could find on James Kavanaugh. True to her word, within hours, Cassidy had an old photograph of a man with her exact same eyes and curly hair, along with his last known address from about 10 years ago. That night, after Emma was asleep, Cassidy showed David everything she'd discovered. "What are you going to do?" he asked, studying the photo of James Kavanaugh. "I'm going to find him," Cassidy said firmly. "But first, I need to confront my mother about why she lied to me my entire life while telling everyone else the truth." David looked concerned. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" After how she treated you, and Emma Cassidy nodded, a new determination hardening within her. "I deserve answers, and Emma deserves to know her real heritage. But more than that, I want Barbara to know that her perfectly constructed Mitchell family fantasy is about to come crashing down." What Cassidy didn't tell David was the other revelation that had come to her while piecing together this family mystery. During her search for information about James Kavanaugh, she'd stumbled upon financial records that suggested the Mitchell Construction Company, the source of the family's wealth and status, might not have been Richard's creation after all. An old newspaper article mentioned James Kavanaugh as a founding investor in a construction business that later became Mitchell Construction. If true, it meant that not only had Barbara stolen Cassidy's chance to know her real father, but the Mitchells had potentially built their entire fortune on something they had taken from him as well. The more Cassidy uncovered, the more she realized this wasn't just about a missing dinner plate or even her hidden paternity. It was about decades of deception, theft, and calculated cruelty, and she was becoming increasingly determined that everyone responsible would finally face the consequences. 3 days after New Year's, Cassidy stood on the doorstep of the Mitchell estate alone. She had insisted that David stay home with Emma. This confrontation wasn't something her daughter needed to witness. The familiar house, with its imposing columns and perfect symmetry, no longer felt like a childhood home, but like the headquarters of an elaborate conspiracy against her. She rang the doorbell, steeling herself for what was to come. Barbara answered, her expression shifting quickly from surprise to a practiced smile. "Cassidy, I'm so glad you came. We've been worried sick." Her mother stepped aside to let her in, already launching into a rehearsed speech. "About Christmas dinner, I may have misspoken. Of course, Emma is family." "I was just flustered with all the arrangements." Cassidy walked past her into the familiar foyer, noting how nothing had changed: the same antique console table, the same family portraits lining the wall. Except now she noticed something she'd overlooked before. In every family photo, she was positioned slightly apart from the others, as if the photographer had subconsciously acknowledged her separate status. "Is Dad home?" Cassidy asked deliberately, using the term that now felt hollow on her tongue. "He's in his study. I'll get him." Barbara seemed relieved at the normal-sounding question, clearly hoping this would be a reconciliation visit. When both Barbara and Richard were seated across from her in the formal living room, the one reserved for important guests, Cassidy placed a manila folder on the coffee table between them. "I know about James Kavanaugh," she said without preamble. The color drained from Barbara's face, while Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Neither spoke. "What I want to know," Cassidy continued, "is why everyone knew except me, why my own siblings were told the truth while I was kept in the dark my entire life." Barbara recovered first, her shoulders squaring defensively. "We were protecting you." "What good would it have done for you to know Richard raised you as his own?" "Did he?" Cassidy challenged. "Because from where I'm sitting, he treated me differently my entire life." "Less than." "Not good enough for the precious Mitchell name that I now know I never really had." "That's not fair." Richard finally spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "I provided for you, the bare minimum," Cassidy interrupted. "College loans, while Michael got a free ride. No help with my house, while Jennifer got a down payment. A lifetime of subtle rejections that I convinced myself I was imagining." She turned her attention to Barbara. "But you knew exactly what you were doing. You told Michael and Jennifer so they would understand why I was treated differently. You made sure everyone knew except me, so I'd always be wondering what was wrong with me, why I wasn't good enough." "That's ridiculous," Barbara snapped, but her eyes darted away, unable to maintain contact. "You're making mountains out of molehills." "So what if Richard isn't your biological father? He's the only father you've known." "Because I wasn't allowed to know my real father," Cassidy countered, opening the folder to reveal the newspaper clippings she'd found. James Kavanaugh, the man who helped start what became Mitchell Construction before mysteriously transferring his ownership shares to Richard right around the time I was born. Was that the deal, Mom? His business in exchange for walking away from his child? Richard's head snapped up, genuine shock, registering on his face as he looked at Barbara. "You said James voluntarily sold his shares because he was moving to Boston." Barbara's composed facade cracked slightly. "He did move to Boston. The rest wasn't relevant." "Wasn't relevant," Richard's voice rose. "You told me he wanted out of the business." "You never said." He stopped abruptly, seeming to remember Cassidy's presence. I think there's a lot Mom hasn't told either of us. Cassidy said, a cold satisfaction spreading through her as she watched them both squirm. Did you know James tried to make contact when I was 5? That Mom threatened him with harassment charges if he came near me. Richard's stunned expression was answer enough. I found Aunt Susan, Cassidy continued. She was quite happy to fill in the blanks after 30 years of silence. Apparently, she tried to tell me the truth when I was a teenager, which is why you cut her out of the family. Susan was always jealous of what Richard and I built, Barbara said dismissively, but her voice lacked conviction. What you built on the foundation James provided, Cassidy corrected. I've been doing my research, Mom. The original business license for what became Mitchell Construction lists James Kavanaugh as the primary owner with startup capital. 3 months after I was born, the business was restructured, with all shares transferred to Richard, and the name changed. That's quite a coincidence. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken truths. Finally, Richard turned to Barbara, his expression hardening. Did you blackmail him? He asked quietly. Did you use the child to take his business? Barbara's laugh was brittle. Don't be dramatic, Richard. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement. He was young, unmarried, not ready for a family or the responsibility of a growing business. You wanted both. I wanted a family that was mine, Richard said, his voice tight. You promised me after Cassidy that there would be no more secrets, that we would start fresh. Was that a lie too? Cassidy watched the exchange with a detached fascination. The perfect Mitchell marriage was apparently built on as many lies as her own identity. I have one more question, Cassidy said, drawing their attention back to her. Why did you tell Emma she wasn't family? She's an innocent child. Whatever your issues with me or my paternity, why punish her? For the first time, Barbara looked genuinely uncomfortable. It was a thoughtless comment. I was stressed with hosting. No, Cassidy shook her head. You've had a lifetime of practice hiding the truth. You don't make thoughtless comments. You wanted her to know she didn't belong, just like you've always wanted me to feel that I didn't belong. That's absurd, Barbara protested, but weakly. Is it because Emma looks exactly like James? Cassidy pulled out a photograph of her daughter side by side with the old picture of James Kavanaugh that Susan had provided. The resemblance was striking: the same curly hair, the same dimple when they smiled. You couldn't stand seeing his face in your granddaughter, could you? A constant reminder of your affair and manipulation. Barbara's silence was confirmation enough. Well, I'm done being your family secret, Cassidy said, gathering her documents. And I'm done letting you make my daughter feel less than. I've contacted James Kavanaugh, and he's agreed to meet with me next week. The shock on both their faces gave Cassidy a grim satisfaction. You can't do that, Barbara said quickly, panic edging into her voice. There were agreements made, agreements I wasn't party to, Cassidy. Cut her off. I'm 34 years old, Mom. Whatever legal maneuvers you pulled when I was a baby don't apply anymore. She stood to leave, but Richard's voice stopped her. What do you want, Cassidy? He asked, sounding suddenly tired and old. Money. Is that why you're dredging this up now? The question stung more than Cassidy had expected. I don't want your money. I want the truth. I want acknowledgement of what was taken from me, my identity, my relationship with my biological father, my place in this family. And I want Emma to know her real heritage, not the sanitized version you created. Barbara stood her composure, returning like armor sliding back into place. And if we refuse, if we deny everything you're saying, it would be your word against ours, and we have decades of community respect behind us. Cassidy smiled for the first time since entering the house. I was hoping you might say that. She removed a small digital recorder from her pocket and placed it on the table. Massachusetts is a one-party consent state for recordings. Everything you've both said since I walked in is documented. And there's a copy of every document I've found with my lawyer, along with a detailed account of the Christmas dinner incident witnessed by 12 people. The blood drained from Barbara's face. You wouldn't dare expose this family to scandal. Wouldn't I? You've never really known me, Mom, because you've never wanted to. But I'm not the compliant middle child desperate for your approval anymore. Cassidy picked up the recorder and moved toward the door. I'm meeting with James next Tuesday. After that, I'll decide what happens to the Mitchell family reputation. As she reached the door, Richard called after her. Cassidy, wait. What if? What if we make this right? Whatever you think is fair. Cassidy turned back, studying the man she'd called father her entire life. For the first time, she saw fear in his eyes, not just of public exposure, but perhaps of losing her completely. I'll be in touch after I meet James, she said finally. But understand this, making it right isn't just about money or public statements, it's about Emma. She deserves grandparents who truly see her as family, who love her without conditions or qualifications. If you can't be those people, then we have nothing more to discuss. With that, Cassidy walked out of the Mitchell estate, feeling lighter than she had in years. The confrontation hadn't provided all the answers, but it had shifted something fundamental in her understanding of herself and her place in the world. As she drove away, her phone began buzzing with texts from Michael and Jennifer. Apparently, Barbara had immediately reached out to rally the troops. Cassidy silenced her phone without reading the messages. Her siblings had made their choice years ago when they'd accepted the truth about her paternity without ever telling her. Now she was making hers. I know you've been following this family drama closely, and trust me, this confrontation was even more intense than I could have imagined. If you're enjoying this journey of discovery and standing up to family betrayal, please hit that like button and subscribe. Next, I'm going to share what happened when I finally met my biological father after 34 years. And believe me, what I discovered changed everything I thought I knew about myself and the Mitchell family fortune. The coffee shop in downtown Boston was busy enough to provide privacy in plain sight, but quiet enough for conversation. Cassidy arrived 20 minutes early, securing a corner table with her back to the wall so she could watch the door. Despite her outward composure, her hands trembled slightly as she arranged her belongings, a notebook, her phone, and a small envelope containing childhood photos she'd brought to share. She'd spoken with James Kavanaugh twice on the phone since tracking him down. Their conversations had been cautious, emotional, and surreal. Hearing his voice with the same slight lift at the end of sentences that she recognized in her own speech patterns had been both comforting and disorienting. They had agreed to meet in person in neutral territory to begin the process of knowing each other. At exactly 1:00 p.m., a man entered the coffee shop, hesitating at the doorway. Even from a distance, Cassidy would have recognized him anywhere. Though in his 60s now, with silver threading through his once dark curls, James Kavanaugh had the same eyes that stared back at her in the mirror every morning. The same eyes Emma had inherited. He spotted her immediately, as if some biological instinct guided him. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the crowded space, 34 years of separation condensed into a single charged moment. James approached slowly, his expression cycling through nervousness, wonder, and a profound sadness that made Cassidy's throat tighten. When he reached the table, he didn't sit immediately. Cassidy, he said, her name sounding different in his voice, reverent almost. You look so much like your grandmother, my mother. It was perhaps the most meaningful greeting he could have offered, an immediate connection to a family history she'd never known she had. I wouldn't know, Cassidy replied softly. I've never seen pictures of her. Pain flashed across his face. No, I suppose you wouldn't have. He gestured to the empty chair. May I? The first hour passed in a strange dance of cautious questions and revelations. James ordered coffee but barely touched it too, intent on absorbing every detail about the daughter he'd lost. Cassidy learned that her biological father had been a finance major who discovered a talent for construction management while renovating his first house. That his mother, Cassidy's grandmother, had been an Irish immigrant who taught elementary school. That he played the guitar and had once dreamed of being a musician before practicality led him to business. "I have a box of birthday cards," James said, suddenly midway through a story about his college days, 34 of them. "One for every birthday since you were born. I wrote to you even knowing you might never see them." Cassidy swallowed hard. "I'd like to read them sometime." He nodded, then asked tentatively, "Your daughter Emma, right? How is she?" "She's wonderful," Cassidy said, reaching for her phone to show pictures. "Smart kind, stubborn in all the right ways. She loves science and art equally, can't decide which is her favorite subject." James studied the photos with undisguised emotion. "She has the Kavanaugh dimple," he observed, touching his own cheek, where an identical dimple appeared when he smiled. "My mother would have adored her." The conversation inevitably turned to the past, to Barbara, Richard, and the circumstances that had separated father and daughter. "Did you know about me from the beginning?" Cassidy asked the question that had been burning inside her since discovering her true paternity. James nodded slowly. "Barbara told me she was pregnant right away. She was certain you were mine. The timing made it impossible for you to be Richard's. At first I was thrilled. Terrified too, but ready to step up." His expression darkened. "But Barbara made it clear that wasn't an option. Because she was already married to Richard Cassidy supplied." "Yes, but it was more complicated than that. Barbara and Richard were struggling. Our affair was wrong, I won't excuse it. But it wasn't just physical. Barbara and I had a connection, or at least I thought we did." He looked away, old pain evident in his features. "When she got pregnant, I wanted to make a life with her and the baby with you. But she said Richard had agreed to raise you as his own to avoid scandal and that it would be best for everyone." Cassidy frowned. "But you tried to see me when I was 5. What changed?" James sighed heavily. "I respected their marriage for years, staying away as promised. But I couldn't stop thinking about you. I saw a little girl in the park once who looked about your age, and something broke inside me. I hired a private investigator who confirmed you were living with Barbara, and Richard's seemingly happy. I just wanted to know you to be some small part of your life. What happened when you approached them? Richard actually seemed willing to discuss some arrangement, perhaps introducing me as a family friend, but Barbara was adamant. She threatened to ruin me professionally to tell everyone I was harassing her family." He paused, clearly weighing how much to reveal. "And she reminded me of our business arrangement. The construction company Cassidy said connecting the dots. You founded it, didn't you? Not Richard." James nodded slowly. "Mitchell Construction was originally Kavanaugh Building Solutions. I started it right out of college, with a small inheritance from my grandfather. Barbara worked in the bank that approved my first business loan. That's how we met. And you gave it to Richard in exchange for walking away from me." The question held no accusation, only a need to understand. "Not willingly," James said quietly. "Barbara made it clear that if I didn't transfer ownership and leave town, she would claim I had embezzled funds. She had manufactured evidence she worked in the financial department. She knew how to make it look convincing. It would have meant prison, not just losing you." Cassidy sat back processing this new information. "So they built their entire fortune, their social standing, everything on a company they essentially stole from you." "I made a choice," James said, though pain lingered in his voice. "I thought maybe someday when you were older I could find you and explain. I never imagined they would keep the truth from you your entire life." "My siblings knew," Cassidy said bitterly. "Apparently everyone knew except me." James reached across the table, hesitating before gently covering her hand with his. I'm so sorry, Cassidy. Not a day has gone by that I haven't thought of you and wondered who you were becoming. The raw honesty in his voice broke something open inside Cassidy. For the first time since the Christmas dinner revelation, she let herself cry, not the angry tears she'd shed in private, but deep healing tears for all the years lost. When she finally composed herself, she asked the question that had been hovering unspoken between them. What happens now? I have a life, a family, and you've missed so much. That's entirely up to you, James said gently. I won't push for more than you're comfortable with. Just meeting you, knowing you've grown into such a remarkable woman, it's already more than I dared hope for. Cassidy studied his face, her face in many ways, and made a decision. I'd like Emma to know her grandfather, her real grandfather. And I'd like to know you too, if you're willing to be patient with how complicated this all is. James's smile transformed his entire face, the dimple appearing prominently. I've waited 34 years. I think I can manage patience. As they parted ways, a few hours later, plans already made to meet again the following weekend, with Emma Cassidy felt a peculiar sense of peace settling over her. Finding James hadn't erased the betrayal of the Mitchells, but it had filled a void she hadn't fully recognized until now. On the drive back home, Cassidy's phone rang. It was her lawyer Marcus calling with unexpected news. I've been reviewing those documents you sent over, he said, without preamble. The original business transfer from Kavanaugh to Mitchell, there are serious issues with it. The terms were clearly coercive, and the timing immediately after your birth makes it look exactly like what it was, a form of blackmail. What are you saying? Cassidy asked, putting the call on speaker as she navigated the highway. I'm saying that if you wanted to pursue legal action, you'd have a case. The statute of limitations on fraud of this magnitude, especially when concealment was involved, could be argued to start from the date of discovery, which would be now not 34 years ago. Cassidy absorbed this information silently, thinking of the Mitchell family fortune, built on a foundation that rightfully belonged to her biological father. Would such a case become public, she finally asked. Almost certainly, Marcus confirmed. These kinds of proceedings rarely stay private, especially with prominent local families involved. As Cassidy ended the call, a plan began forming in her mind, not for revenge exactly, but for justice long overdue. Over the next 3 months, Cassidy's life transformed in ways she could never have anticipated. Emma and James had formed an immediate bond, their shared dimples and curly hair just the beginning of their similarities. They discovered a mutual love for building things, James with his architectural knowledge, Emma with her Lego sets and science projects. It was as if some genetic memory had passed between generations despite their separation. David, after initial wariness, had welcomed James into their lives with surprising ease. He looks at you the way I look at Emma, David had observed quietly one evening after James had left their home. Like you're the most precious thing in the world. The Mitchells, meanwhile, had launched a campaign of damage control. Barbara called daily, leaving voicemails that oscillated between tearful apologies and thinly veiled threats about family loyalty. Richard sent formal emails proposing financial settlements to make amends, all requiring signed non-disclosure agreements. Michael and Jennifer reached out with awkward attempts at reconciliation, both claiming they'd always seen Cassidy as a full sister, despite their complicity in the family secret. Cassidy let them all stew in uncertainty, focusing instead on building her relationship with James and protecting Emma from the toxic dynamics of the Mitchell family. But as winter turned to spring, Cassidy knew a resolution was needed. The Mitchell family's influence in their community was too significant to ignore indefinitely. After extensive consultations with her lawyer and many long conversations with James and David, Cassidy finally invited the entire Mitchell family to a meeting at her lawyer's office. Barbara had objected to the location, insisting it should be a family matter discussed at home, but Cassidy had been firm. This would happen on her terms, or not at all. The conference room felt unnecessarily formal with its long mahogany table and leather chairs, but Cassidy appreciated the neutrality it provided. James sat beside her with David on her other side. Marcus, her lawyer, positioned himself at the head of the table, various documents arranged neatly before him. The Mitchells arrived as a unit, Barbara and Richard followed by Michael and Jennifer with their spouses. Their unified front might have intimidated Cassidy once, but today she felt only a calm certainty about the path ahead. Once everyone was seated, Barbara immediately took control, as was her habit. "I hope we can put this unfortunate misunderstanding behind us today," she began, her voice carrying the practiced warmth she used for public appearances. "Family is family regardless of biology." Cassidy allowed a small smile. "That's actually why we're here, Mom, to discuss what family really means and what obligations come with it." Marcus distributed folders to everyone present. "These contain documents I believe will be relevant to our discussion today," he explained professionally. "I'd like to direct your attention to the first tab." Richard opened his folder first, his expression hardening as he recognized the original business transfer papers from Kavanaugh Building Solutions to what became Mitchell Construction. "This is ancient history," he said dismissively, though his fingers tightened visibly on the papers. "Ancient history that was deliberately concealed," Marcus countered smoothly. "As you'll see in the analysis, provided the transfer meets all legal criteria for fraudulent inducement and coercion." The subsequent company growth documented in Tab 2 shows that approximately 87% of the Mitchell family's current net worth derives directly from assets that were improperly acquired. Barbara's face had lost all color. "This is absurd. There was a fair business transaction, orchestrated under threat of false criminal charges." James interjected quietly. It was the first time he had spoken, and all eyes turned to him. "I have sworn affidavits from the bank employees who witnessed Barbara's manipulations of the financial records. They've kept silent all these years out of fear, but they're willing to testify now." Michael looked between his parents, confusion evident. "Dad, is this true? The company wasn't yours." Richard's silence was damning. Jennifer turned accusingly to Barbara. "You always said Mitchell Construction was Dad's vision, his legacy to us. That's why Cassidy wasn't included in the succession planning, because she wasn't a real Mitchell." "Was that all a lie?" "It was necessary," Barbara said stiffly. "For the family's security." "For your security," Cassidy corrected, "because you couldn't stand the idea that your perfect life might be tarnished by the truth. So you stole a man's business, kept him from his child, and spent 34 years pretending it was all for the good of the family." Barbara's composure finally cracked. "You have no idea what it was like back then. I was trapped in a failing marriage with a man who couldn't build anything of his own. James's company was our only chance at the life we deserved." "The life you deserved," Richard interrupted, his voice strangely hollow. "I never wanted any of this, Barbara. The big house, the social climbing, the country club memberships. I just wanted a family that was actually mine." He looked at Cassidy with something like regret. "I failed you. I knew what Barbara was doing wasn't right, but I went along with it because I was afraid of losing everything. In the end, I lost what mattered most anyway." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Marcus cleared his throat and directed everyone to the third tab in their folders. "This outlines our proposed resolution," he explained. "It's quite straightforward. The Mitchell Construction Company will be restructured to reflect its true ownership history. 51% of shares will be transferred to James Kavanaugh as the rightful founder. The remaining 49% will remain with the Mitchell family, minus a 10% share that will be placed in trust for Emma Mitchell." Barbara looked outraged. "This is nothing short of extortion. We built that company into what it is today. With the foundation, James created Cassidy cut in, and with funds that rightfully should have provided for me as his daughter. "This isn't extortion, Mom. It's restitution, and if we refuse," Barbara demanded, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. Marcus smiled thinly. "Then we proceed with the lawsuit outlined in tab 4. Given the evidence we've compiled, including Barbara's recorded admission of coercion from Cassidy's visit in January, we expect to prevail. In that scenario, the Mitchell family would likely lose all ownership interest in the company, face significant financial penalties, and endure very public legal proceedings. The threat of public exposure hung in the air. For people like the Mitchells, whose social standing was paramount, it was perhaps the most significant leverage Cassidy held. Michael, always the pragmatist, spoke up first. This arrangement seemed reasonable given the circumstances. "We retain nearly half the company, and the family name stays on the business. The alternative would be changing it back to Kavanaugh Building Solutions," James said mildly. "Though I'm open to a compromise name to reflect both families' involvement." Jennifer looked between her parents, clearly processing the revelations about their family's foundation. "I think we should accept this offer," she said finally. "It's more than fair, considering what was done." All eyes turned to Richard and Barbara. As always, they would make the final decision. Richard looked aged beyond his years, the weight of decades of deception visibly heavy on his shoulders. "I'll sign," he said quietly. "It's time this family dealt honestly with its past." Barbara's face contorted with barely suppressed rage. "After everything I've sacrificed for this family, enough." Barbara Richard cut her off with uncharacteristic firmness. "You didn't sacrifice. You manipulated and deceived, and you taught our children that family is conditional. I won't continue living that lie." He turned to Cassidy, his expression softening slightly. "For what it's worth, I am sorry. Not just for Christmas, but for every time I failed to be the father you deserved." Cassidy nodded, not quite ready to forgive, but acknowledging the apology nonetheless. The rest of the meeting proceeded with surprising efficiency as papers were signed, terms finalized, and a new chapter in both families' histories began. As they prepared to leave, Barbara approached Cassidy one last time, her voice low and venomous. "You think you've won, but you'll always be the outsider. You were never truly a Mitchell." Cassidy smiled, feeling a weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying her entire life. "That's the thing, Mom. I never wanted to be a Mitchell. I just wanted to be valued for who I am. And now finally I am." She walked out of the conference room with James and David, leaving the Mitchell family to grapple with the consequences of their decades of deception. For the first time, Cassidy felt completely free of the need for their approval or acceptance. She had found her real family not just in James, but in the truth of her own identity. 1 year later, on Christmas Eve, Cassidy stood in her kitchen, putting the finishing touches on a batch of gingerbread cookies. The house smelled of pine from the fresh tree in the living room and cinnamon from the mulled cider simmering on the stove. Emma, now 8, was carefully arranging name cards at the dining table. Her idea to ensure everyone had their special place. So much had changed in 12 months. The restructuring of Mitchell Construction, now Kavanaugh Mitchell Builders, had gone smoothly, with James taking an active role in the company he had founded decades earlier. Richard, freed from Barbara's influence after their separation, had rediscovered his passion for hands-on building, often collaborating with James on special projects. Barbara had moved to Florida, maintaining minimal contact with everyone, including surprisingly Jennifer and Michael, who had chosen to align themselves with their father rather than their mother in the aftermath of the revelations. Most importantly, Emma now had a complete family circle: David and Cassidy, James, and even Richard, who had committed himself to being a genuine grandfather figure to her. The wounds weren't all healed, but they were mending with time and honest effort. The doorbell rang and Emma raced to answer it. "Grandpa James is here," she called excitedly, leading him into the kitchen, with his hands clasped firmly in hers. Behind them came Richard, looking slightly awkward but determined, carrying beautifully wrapped packages. Later, as they all gathered around the table for Christmas Eve dinner, Cassidy took a moment to absorb the scene. Every place was set with care. Each person, including Emma, had a place card in Emma's careful handwriting. The family that surrounded her wasn't perfect or conventional, but it was real, built on truth rather than appearances. As Emma shared a joke with James, their identical dimples flashing, Cassidy caught David's eye across the table. His smile reflected her own contentment, an acknowledgement of how far they'd come from last Christmas's painful revelation. Sometimes, Cassidy reflected it takes a broken plate to build a stronger table. I can't thank you enough for joining me on this journey through my family's transformation. If you've ever experienced family betrayal or discovered hidden truths that changed everything you thought you knew, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Has karma or justice ever come full circle in your life like it did in mine? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and share this video if my story resonated with you. I'm grateful for this amazing community that's helped me process these life-changing events. Remember, sometimes our true family isn't determined by blood or names, but by those who truly see and value us for who we are.